So what's the latest in the escalation of fighting in eastern DRC, and what is driving this latest round of fighting?
Yes, Beatrice, we've heard that fighting has resumed in South Kivu province between the M23 rebels, government forces who are backed by Wazalendo militia and Burundian troops in a number of villages and towns in South Kivu province. This fighting began about 6 days ago. It intensified during the signing of the peace deal between the DRC and Rwanda in the U.S. capital, Washington, D.C. and we're
A peace deal in the Democratic Republic of Congo lasted just hours. What was supposed to be a turning point for stability collapsed almost instantly, sparking renewed fighting, shaking regional security, and threatening global markets. How could a plan backed by nations and international institutions fail so fast? The answer reveals just how fragile peace really is in Central Africa.
In the hours after a new peace accord was announced in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a wave of optimism swept across regions that had grown weary of instability. International institutions praised the effort, regional blocs signaled cautious support, and several foreign governments framed the agreement as a critical turning point. Markets reacted positively, humanitarian organizations prepared for improved access, and communities long isolated by conflict allowed themselves to imagine a moment of reprieve. Yet behind the scenes, the fragile foundations of the deal were already beginning to tremble. Before the world could fully absorb the news, reports of renewed fighting spread with alarming speed, signaling that hopes for a breakthrough might dissolve as quickly as they had arisen. The collapse of the peace accord within hours surprised even seasoned observers who understood how delicate negotiations in the region could be. The Democratic Republic of Congo had attempted similar agreements in the past, each shaped by complex territorial disputes, competing interests over natural resources, and pressure from neighboring states whose own security concerns were deeply connected to events across the border. This new arrangement had been promoted as a comprehensive reset, designed to address long-standing tensions and create a stable framework for cooperation. Countries across Africa had cautiously endorsed the effort, seeing it as a potential opportunity to reduce volatility that had repeatedly spilled across boundaries. Yet while these expectations were high, the underlying reality was far more intricate than the announcement suggested. From the moment the deal was revealed, institutions monitoring the region noted inconsistencies in how key parties interpreted their obligations. Foreign governments that had invested diplomatic capital in supporting the process acknowledged these differences privately, but assumed they could be managed through rapid follow-up discussions. Economic stakeholders had their own concerns, particularly those tied to mining operations and regional trade routes that had been disrupted by clashes. Many hoped the peace accord would provide enough stability to reopen transit corridors, restore supply chains, and calm investor anxiety. But beneath this surface of hopeful anticipation, the roots of distrust still ran deep, nurtured by years of conflicting claims, shifting alliances, and unresolved grievances. When the first reports of renewed fighting emerged, institutions initially treated them as isolated incidents. But as information from monitoring teams accumulated, it became clear that the situation was escalating rather than easing. Observers described movements of armed groups that contradicted the terms of the accord, territorial advances that suggested strategic motives, and the breakdown of communication channels meant to prevent misunderstandings. Regional blocs attempted emergency outreach, urging all sides to return to the commitments made only hours earlier, but their appeals were overshadowed by rising tension on the ground. What had begun as cautious optimism was rapidly transforming into uncertainty. The abrupt collapse of the peace agreement exposed the fragile nature of stability in the region. Neighboring countries, already managing the pressures of displaced populations and intermittent border disruptions, braced for new challenges. Some governments strengthened security along critical crossings, while others convened emergency consultations with international partners. Humanitarian agencies that had prepared for improved access now had to recalculate their plans, anticipating new obstacles that could further restrict movement and delay assistance. The sudden shift undermined confidence among communities that had hoped the accord would mark a turning point, breeding frustration and renewed anxiety. Global organizations issued statements urging restraint, stabilization, and renewed diplomatic engagement. several foreign governments, including major powers with long-standing interests in Central Africa, expressed concern about the deteriorating situation and the risk of a wider regional impact. Economic observers emphasized how continued instability could hinder major infrastructure projects and disrupt trade networks connecting multiple African states. Institutions monitoring mineral supply chains highlighted the possibility of new uncertainties, as disruptions in the Democratic Republic of Congo often reverberated through global markets reliant on vital resources extracted within its borders. The stakes extended beyond national boundaries, reflecting the interconnected nature of modern geopolitical and economic systems. The renewed fighting also forced regional blocs to confront the limits of their influence. Organizations tasked with conflict resolution attempted to revive communication channels, but the deterioration of trust made progress difficult. Diplomatic teams emphasized the importance of preventing escalation, reminding stakeholders that conflict in the region had historically triggered ripple effects across East and Central Africa. Countries with shared borders faced the risk of disrupted trade routes and increased movement of displaced civilians, while governments farther away considered how instability might reshape broader security dynamics. The fragility of the peace accord became a stark reminder that even well-coordinated diplomatic efforts could unravel quickly if underlying tensions remained unresolved. International observers sought to understand why the peace deal failed so swiftly. Analysts pointed to competing territorial claims, resource-driven interests, and disputed interpretations of security arrangements. Some institutions argued that the accord lacked sufficient enforcement mechanisms, making violations difficult to deter. Others suggested that negotiations had moved too quickly, driven by pressure from global stakeholders eager for a breakthrough. Regardless of the precise cause, the speed at which the situation deteriorated revealed the depth of mistrust between different factions and the challenges facing any attempt to stabilize the region. The renewed conflict was not simply the result of a single breakdown, but a reflection of long-term structural issues. The abrupt reversal also influenced global perceptions of stability in Central Africa. Countries that had hoped the peace deal would facilitate investment and economic growth found themselves reassessing the risks. Market analysts noted fluctuations in commodity prices linked to uncertainties in the region, particularly those tied to critical minerals essential for global industries. Infrastructure projects aimed at strengthening regional connectivity faced delays, while private investors sought clarity from institutions monitoring the crisis. The collapse of the accord underscored how political and security developments in the Democratic Republic of Congo could affect economic planning far beyond its borders. Humanitarian organizations continued sounding alarms as renewed fighting disrupted essential services. Communities that had been preparing for improved access now feared further isolation. Displacement trends shifted again, placing pressure on neighboring states and overstretching existing support systems. Global relief institutions attempted to adjust their operations, but disruptions made it difficult to deliver consistent assistance. The brief hope created by the peace announcement had quickly transformed into renewed uncertainty, leaving vulnerable populations caught between expectations of stability and the reality of continuing conflict. As the situation unfolded, foreign governments engaged in urgent consultations with regional blocs to prevent a broader escalation. Statements emphasized the importance of returning to dialogue, restoring communication channels, and protecting civilians. Some countries pledged additional support for monitoring mechanisms, while others offered to facilitate new negotiations. Yet despite these efforts, observers acknowledged that rebuilding trust would be a long and difficult process. Years of intermittent conflict had created deep divides, and even the most carefully structured agreements struggled to address the underlying causes. The collapse of the peace accord also highlighted how global geopolitical dynamics intersected with regional conflicts. Major economies that relied on supply chains connected to resources from the Democratic Republic of Congo monitored developments closely, aware that prolonged instability could disrupt production cycles and market projections. Institutions focused on sustainable development warned that repeated cycles of conflict threatened long-term progress, undermining initiatives designed to promote economic diversification and environmental management. Global security analysts noted that instability in one part of Central Africa could influence broader patterns of cooperation and competition across the continent. Despite the uncertainty, diplomatic efforts did not cease. Regional blocs continued engaging with stakeholders, hoping to rebuild a foundation for dialogue. International organizations emphasized that even though the peace deal had collapsed, the need for negotiation remained urgent. Countries with influence in the region attempted to recalibrate their strategies, acknowledging that sustainable stability would require long-term commitment rather than rapid announcements. The focus shifted from celebrating a breakthrough to mitigating the consequences of its failure. While the renewed fighting served as a stark reminder of the challenges, it also reinforced the importance of persistent diplomatic engagement. In the days following the collapse, analysts reflected on how the situation had evolved so quickly. Some argued that the peace deal had been overly ambitious, attempting to resolve too many issues at once. Others suggested that the timing of the announcement had created unrealistic expectations, fueling disappointment when immediate improvements failed to materialize. Institutions monitoring the crisis emphasized that genuine peace required addressing local concerns as much as regional and international dynamics. The breakdown underscored the importance of inclusive dialogue, enforcement mechanisms, and realistic timelines. The renewed uncertainty left communities across the region grappling with difficult questions. Many had hoped the peace accord would open the door to improved security, economic opportunities, and greater connectivity with neighboring areas. The rapid return to instability created a climate of frustration, particularly among groups that had endured repeated cycles of conflict. Yet despite these challenges, some local leaders expressed cautious hope that the international attention generated by the collapse might lead to more sustained engagement from global institutions. Their position reflected the belief that even failed agreements could pave the way for future negotiations if handled carefully. As the world absorbed the implications of the failed accord, conversations within international institutions shifted toward identifying structural gaps that had hindered the agreement from achieving immediate traction. Analysts stressed that any sustainable peace framework would require deeper engagement from regional actors whose security and trade interests were directly affected. These discussions also highlighted the importance of integrating economic, environmental, and social considerations into future negotiations. The region's natural resources, particularly minerals vital to global industries, continued to shape patterns of cooperation and competition, making economic stability an essential component of any long-term solution. Foreign governments evaluating the aftermath recognized that renewed instability could influence broader geopolitical alignments. Several countries began coordinating their assessments of risk, focusing on areas where fragile infrastructure might become vulnerable to disruption. International development agencies reviewed ongoing projects, considering how instability might alter timelines or require enhanced safeguards. Institutions involved in peace-building emphasized the importance of strengthening local governance structures to foster resilience. These efforts underscored the principle that external diplomacy alone could not resolve deeply rooted tensions without parallel progress on internal reforms. The collapse of the peace accord also sparked debate about the role of regional blocs in managing crises. While these organizations had provided diplomatic support and mediation, the renewed fighting exposed limitations in their ability to enforce commitments. Some observers argued that regional mechanisms needed greater authority and resources to support compliance and conflict prevention. Others suggested that enhanced collaboration with global institutions might offer a more balanced approach. This debate highlighted the evolving nature of regional governance in Africa and the need for adaptable strategies that could respond to complex security environments.